Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the rising voice of the employee. Millions of young people around the world are quitting their jobs and rethinking the way they live. So what's driving the so-called Great Resignation? It's been a bumpy year for one of the world's busiest shipping routes, Egypt's Suez Canal. So why has the waterway recorded the highest ever revenues? And could Omicron variants scupper maritime trade recovery? A tea war or a storm in a teacup? Indian businesses are lobbying the government to impose taxes and regulations on tea imports from Nepal. Nepalese farmers say it is a fight for survival. The pandemic has changed people's lives and, in many cases, their career plans. After a wave of job losses in the past couple of years, a lot of employees are now hitting the pause button in their careers and quitting their jobs in droves. And at least 40% of employees globally are considering resigning in the coming few months. More than 24 million people quit their jobs in the United States from April to September. And a record 4.5 million people resigned in November alone, the most since the government started collecting this data 2 decades ago. Job openings are increasing and wages are going up as companies scramble to find employees. China has experienced a similar movement known as lying flat, which effectively means quitting ambitious careers in favor of simpler, less materialistic lives. It started as a social media campaign against a system that requires people to work from 9 in the morning until 9 in the evening, 6 days a week, and yet still unable to afford a home. In Europe, a recent study by the German-based software company Personio revealed that more than 46% of workers are planning to quit their jobs in the next 6 to 12 months. Germany has reported the highest numbers of resignations last year, followed by the UK and the Netherlands. The increase in resignations among employees is happening while the world faces another major challenge. Omicron is leading to a global labour shortage that is threatening economic recovery, with the airline industry among the most affected sectors. The US and the UK are taking people infected by coronavirus out of isolation quicker to get them back to work faster. I'm joined now from London by Grace Lorden, Director of the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics. Many thanks for joining the programme. What do you think is going on here? Are people rethinking the way they work and live? Is it an employees' revolution, or are there underlying reasons?
Well, first, Marlene, thank you for having me on the show. And I think on the first case, Omicron is bearing its toll. So we do have people who are taking time off because they've been exposed to somebody with Omicron, depending on their country's policies, or that they themselves actually have Omicron. But I think on the second side of it, what was really interesting about COVID-19 in general is that it did 2 things for people. I think first, it made death salient. So people really were faced with mortality burden every single day. And I think secondly, for many professionals in particular, it gave them insight as to what it would mean to spend more time at home. And if you couple that with what was happening with the economy before COVID in many developed countries, so we've had, wage stagnation, the price of housing has actually soared, jobs have become more precarious. I think a lot of people actually realized when they went home in lockdown and COVID that they were basically running to stand still. So they were, finding it difficult to pay their bills despite working very, very hard. And that's caused a lot of people to reevaluate. And what we're seeing now are shifts in the labour market as people's preferences change, perhaps to having more leisure time at home, and they're figuring out how to make that happen.
Is it, though, mostly people completely opting out of the labour market permanently?
So I think there's a narrative in the media at the moment that there's some shift in the younger generations towards kind of what they call a low desire lifestyle, which basically means they need less money in order to survive. I believe less in that story because I haven't seen it in the data yet. What we do see in the data is what I would call the great reshuffle. So rather than people having kind of this great resignation, they're choosing different jobs to go into. They're choosing perhaps to become self-employed as opposed to work for an employer. And they're choosing kind of overall to work less hours and have more a balanced lifestyle. And that's particularly true for professional workers who are in industries like technology and finance, where the competition for talent is rife.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. What kind of sectors are most affected? Is it mostly finance and technology?
So I think we see kind of two. I would kind of split what's happening into two different places. So first, you have the pressure for professional workers, where professional workers are demanding now more than ever hybrid working. Some are demanding a 4-day week, and this is really kind of taking flight in places where there is this competition for talent. And what we've noticed in some of the companies is some of the companies are saying, actually, you need to be in the office all the time, and those companies have been increasing wages in order to secure enough talent so that they actually meet their deliverables. Whereas other companies are recognizing that hybrid working, flexible working is an amenity that people want and that they can attract talent with. And they've been using that as a mechanism to attract talent. I think on the other side of it, we also see pressure in services and retail, in the minimum wage jobs. So, working in fast food restaurants, working in shops, where there are now shortages of baristas, waiters, and people to help you at the till. And there's been a demand on that side for higher wages, or people are actually choosing to opt at home. And we're seeing that as a bigger trend, which is not surprising, in countries where they have higher safety nets. And if we go back to this idea of having, a slightly lower desired life, it means that people who were on minimum wage previously might be making the choice to stay at home as opposed to going to work unless they get that wage increase.
Does that mean the balance of power is tilting towards the labour force?
I think at the moment, at the minimum wage jobs, the balance of power has tilted towards the labour force. I think it's only a transition, because you have to remember that a lot of workers will be actually out sick because of COVID. So we see shortages because of that. We're also seeing shortages because people are choosing to be less mobile for work, so kind of choosing to live perhaps in their hometown rather than travel. The travel to work has shrunk during the COVID-19 epidemic, which isn't surprising. So I think for now we're in this transition phase.
It's difficult to imagine a time when COVID is no longer an issue, but do you think what we're seeing is temporary, or is this a long-term trend?
I think for the for workers of low wage, I think it's temporary. I think once the labour market has more adequate supply of baristas, people at the till, and waiters and waitresses, we will see some adjustment backwards. What might change that is if big corporations become more socially responsible and start paying a wage premium to their minimum wage workers, and that remains to be seen. There's no evidence that that's coming yet. I think what's more interesting is the transition phase for professional workers. And we will absolutely have a legacy of hybrid working. We will absolutely have a legacy of, I don't believe it will be reduced hours, but hours that can be conducted with more autonomy. So people might choose, for example, to work 4 days a week, do their 40, 50 hours, and then have Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. People will have more autonomy to work in the mornings and the evenings, particularly in jobs where you can complete tasks on your own and with autonomy.
This phenomena of people quitting their jobs in great numbers, we've seen that all around the world, from China to Europe to America. But is it for the same reasons?
I think ultimately, if we were to ask people, they would give different reasons. So people would talk about, wages being too low. People would talk about mental health. People would talk about burnout. And I think in all the countries you've mentioned, those three things have actually come up. I think what's held in common with all the countries that you mentioned has been this economic pressure on the labour market, where we've had a bigger divide between high income and low income jobs. Even if you're in high income jobs, you do struggle in the beginning of your career to buy a house. You do struggle much more often to get to the top of the pole. There's much less positions. So in some ways, I think this is a reaction to an economic buildup that's been happening for a long time, where we've seen a big gap kind of come between the very, very rich and everybody else in society. And what the pandemic has highlighted is that people have choices. You can kind of step off the treadmill, if you like, and choose something else.
So what kind of impact have these mass resignations had on the wider economy?
I mean, I think we see it already trickling through inflation. So the minimum wage jobs that I mentioned in retail and in takeaway, I think, people who are listening to the show will recognize that now when they go to the supermarket or when they go to get their coffee, it is more expensive. So ultimately, these pay increases will always be felt by the consumer. People have seen disruption to their flights if they've been traveling abroad, both because of direct impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, and also some people who work in the airline industry choosing to look for a job that has more balanced lifestyles. And I think also what remains to be seen is what it means for the major cities around the world. So as the professional workers come out of the hubs that have been carved out for particular industries, it does mean a reshuffle of, the services like cafes, cleaning, other people who might be driving them to move to where they're now living, and that hasn't yet happened. I think here in London, there's still a really great hope that everybody's going to go back into the city of London and start working once the pandemic dissipates. I kind of hold a compromise view. I think people will go back to the work, but it will be part-time. So we'll see some movement in the economy for those minimum wage jobs.
OK, many thanks for your time and your analysis. Grace Lorden, Director of the Inclusion Initiative from the London School of Economics. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Vessels waiting outside ports, labour shortages at harbours and supply chain bottlenecks. World trade has faced numerous challenges during the coronavirus health crisis. However, Egypt's Suez Canal recorded unprecedented revenues last year, despite suffering a 6-day blockage by a giant cargo ship. The waterway has earned more than $6.3 billion. That's the highest amount since it was built more than 150 years ago. The Suez Canal Authority says more than 20,600 vessels flowed through its waterways last year. That's an increase of 10% compared to 2020. And the body is expected to increase transit tolls by 6% this year, excluding tourist vessels and liquefied natural gas carriers. Keep in mind, Egypt lost around $15 million a day after the Ever Given giant vessel wedged across the canal for 6 days back in March. Officially opened in 1869, the Suez Canal is one of the world's busiest waterways and a bedrock of the global economy. More than 10% of global trade, including oil, flows through it. The canal remains one of Egypt's top foreign currency earners, with an average 50 vessels passing through it every day. The 193-kilometre long and 24-metre deep waterway connects the Mediterranean and Red Seas. And it is the shortest maritime route between Asia, the Middle East and Europe. The journey between ports in the Gulf and London, for example, is roughly halved by going through the Suez, compared with the alternate route around the southern tip of Africa. Well, the United Nations said maritime trade was expected to increase by 4.3% last year after the economies of many countries started to recover. The increase in demand led to shortages of containers, congested ports and supply chain bottlenecks. Freight rates soared, with an average cost of shipping a standard large container from Asia to Europe at more than $10,000. That's around 4 times higher than it was in 2020. Joining us now from London is Amir Alizadeh, Professor of Shipping, Economics and Finance at Bayes Business School and a member of the faculty at the Kostas Gramenos Centre for Shipping, Trade and Finance. Thank you for joining the programme. Why do you think the Suez Canal has seen these unprecedented revenues?
Thank you. It's been interesting, looking at the figures for Suez Canal. When I looked at it in more detail, I could see that this increase was partly because of increasing trade following, post-COVID. Because we had a drop in international trade the year before, in 2020, where COVID hit hard. But the bounce back from COVID was realized in 2021. So we had increase in international trade there because, some of the factories, manufacturers in the West, they were sort of working at reduced capacity, and they had to import a lot of material from the Far East. The second factor could be attributed to the recent increase in gas demand and trade of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which the traffic of natural gas carriers through Suez Canal has increased as well, especially in the second half of 2021. So that also contributed to the increase in the revenue by the Suez Canal authorities. The number of ships transiting, they are higher in 2021, but there are bigger ships as well, as we've seen, for example, like the one ship that is stuck in the canal. So these bigger ships, they have to pay higher tolls as well.
You mentioned the Ever Given, which blocked the Suez Canal, a huge ship, and it was blocked, I believe, for 6 days. Egypt has had a number of challenges, including the pandemic, to deal with. How has it managed to navigate through all this?
That was a very interesting period because that was the first time Suez Canal was blocked for so many years. And it caused a lot of problem for the international logistics and supply chain. But fortunately, they managed to release the ship within 6 days. And some people, they were expecting, more disruption. But that ship was stuck in a part of a canal due to navigational error or whatever problem was. In a part of a canal that was is relatively narrow and difficult to maneuver for bigger ships. Therefore, the Suez Canal authorities now they're embarking on a plan to basically widen part of the canal, as well as making it deeper for these bigger ships, because these ships are much more than the Suezmax tankers that go through the canal. They're about 400 meters long. But they're shallow in draft. That's why, they're more difficult to maneuver in such a narrow place, and accidents could happen. But, they're taking precautions and also plans to be able to mitigate such problems in future.
Most of the world is now dealing with a fourth wave of coronavirus, specifically the Omicron variant. Do you think maritime trade will take another knock as a result of this?
That's a very good question. What is my view and my analysis from the data that I've seen is that maritime and international trade has been very resilient, especially the whole supply chain that we have and seaborne trade, been very resilient to the COVID situation. If we look back, for example, to the financial crisis of 2008-9, where the GDP dropped, maritime trade affected much more than compared to what we saw during the COVID period. So during the COVID period, we could maintain relatively better flow of commodities and trade by ships. And the bounce back with the post-COVID period is been much better. Now, the fourth wave, in view of many experts, is being much more milder, and the countries, they try to not go to any more lockdowns, try to avoid, for example, any economic slowdown, and that can help maritime trade and shipping. So the more countries avoid lockdowns and a slowdown of economy, then the better it is for maritime economics.
The Ever Given blockage demonstrated the vulnerabilities of international shipping routes, the fragility of supply chains. Has the industry adapted since then?
This can be very slow process to adapt some other measures to avoid, for example, any disruption such as blockage of Suez Canal. However, a lot of industries as well as sectors, they are trying to find other ways, alternatives, to be less dependent on, for example, just-in-time inventory management, as well as purchasing or supply chain. So they try to find alternative ways. For example, they call it nearshoring or inshoring, in order to bring some elements of their production, or perhaps hold a larger amount of inventory in order to avoid, for example, disruptions such as 6 days blockade of Suez Canal. But this will take time, and it can be costly for manufacturers.
Now, the shipping industry needs to also come to grips with climate change, like many other industries. Do you think it's prepared to deal with the urgent need to decarbonize, find alternative fuels, all which, of course, come at an extra cost?
That's a very good and interesting point, because this is ongoing, and it has been started, a while ago, perhaps as early as 2009-10, where International Maritime Organization is going through rounds of debates and meetings in order to set regulations for environment protection and climate change. And some of the bigger shipping companies now, they're embarked on plans to use alternative fuel like ammonia, LNG, or even prepare the ships to have scrubbers in order to reduce the carbon emission. But to go to zero carbon in international trade, in maritime trade, it would be very, very difficult, and it will take time.
So interesting to get your perspective. Amir Alizadeh, a professor of shipping economics and finance at Bayes Business School. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Malia.
The British-era Darjeeling brand is considered the champagne of teas, but is sparking tensions between Indian and Nepalese traders. Tea growers in India want the government to impose taxes and quality control checks on imports from Nepal to protect their businesses. Nepalese farmers insist their product fills a gap in the market. Zain Basravi has more from Ilam district in eastern Nepal.
No soldiers, no guns. But at Nepal's eastern border with India, tensions are simmering. Open fields are a front line where for years the two countries have been locked in a quiet conflict over one of the world's most precious and widely consumed commodities. For Nepal's tea plantations, this is a fight for survival.
Tea is the goose that lays the golden egg. There's local production happening, we have local companies here. Worldwide, people drink tea, and it's also good for health. We drink it, and we call Ilam district the place to mine for tea.
In Ilam's markets, Himalayan tea is as good as liquid gold, a major source of fuel for the country's economic engine. But growers from the neighboring Indian state of West Bengal are lobbying their government to impose tariffs and bureaucratic roadblocks and take their landlocked neighbors' tea off the table.
We're here at Nepal's border with India now, and Darjeeling is just 30 minutes down this road past that checkpoint. Now, the terrain, the soil, even the plants that the tea comes from, it's all the same in this area, but Indian growers say that theirs is the original Darjeeling brand and only their tea should be allowed to carry the name.
The seeds of what some Nepalese have taken to calling the Kettle Wars were planted more than a century ago when the British ruled India. Smuggled out of China and planted in Darjeeling in the 1800s, Indian growers say their tea is the genuine article, and importing from Nepal is destroying a legacy brand. But Indian traders routinely mix Nepalese tea with and sell it as Darjeeling to make up for supply shortfalls and meet massive market demands. In fact, India is Nepal's biggest customer. Half of the tea made here and almost all of the premium grade stuff, most similar to Darjeeling, is bought by India. For Nepalese owners, India stirring up trouble is just about protecting market share.
I feel that India is a very big country with a tiny heart. We have a small economy, and we have a billion and a billion trade deficit with India. Billion and a billion. And we don't have anything to sell our product to India. Only tea is in a very small quantity. That is nothing to the Indian economy, nothing. But the big thing for Nepal, because it gives the village people the employment, the workers employment, and also the contribution in our GDP. It contributes a lot.
Mountainside tea plantations like this one are a real threat to the bigger traditional manufacturers. In terms of quality, they've already been giving competitors a run for their money on the open market. And when it comes to quantity, every year they are getting better at moving higher volumes of product. A thriving tourism industry in full bloom that has grown around Nepal's tea plantations is now also at risk. Brewing tensions steeped in history, at risk of boiling over or a storm in a teacup. It depends on who you ask. Indian concerns have merit, but Nepalese say their tea should move just as freely between their shared borders as their people do. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Ilam district in eastern Nepal.
And that is our show for this week, but I want to know what you think and what you want to see on the show. Tweet me or DM me at Marlene Saeed. And if you're tweeting, then please use the hashtag AJCTC. If email's more your thing, counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed from the Hall team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.